I stood in that courtroom feeling smaller than I ever had before. Not because of fear, but because of the way I was being treated. Every word spoken about me carried a tone of certainty, as if the outcome had already been decided long before I arrived. I didn't interrupt. I didn't argue. I listened while my actions were framed as careless, irresponsible, and indefensible. Each sentence landed heavier than the last, and with every pause, it became clearer that no one expected me to push back. The judge listened. The opposing side spoke confidently. Their version of events sounded complete, polished, and final. I could sense the shift in the room. That subtle moment when people stop questioning and start assuming. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, procedural, and deeply uncomfortable. The kind of humiliation that doesn't come from insults, but from being reduced to a conclusion you didn't get to explain. What made it worse was that everything they said sounded reasonable on the surface. Dates were mentioned. Obligations were listed. Consequences were implied. If I had been watching from the back of the room, I might have believed it too. I might have thought the case was already over. But what no one acknowledged was the document sitting silently inside the court file. A contract everyone referenced, yet no one had actually examined in full. A contract that contained a section so unremarkable in appearance that it had been ignored entirely. As the hearing continued, I realized the humiliation wasn't accidental. It was strategic. It relied on momentum, on authority, and on the assumption that the document would never be questioned. They expected compliance, not scrutiny. I waited, not because I had nothing to say, but because the contract was about to say everything for me. To understand how that moment in court unfolded, it's important to go back to what brought me there in the first place. This case did not start with conflict or confrontation. It started quietly, with an agreement I had signed years earlier, one that governed a professional relationship I believed was stable and clearly defined. Like most contracts, it was treated as a formality at the time, something necessary to move forward, not something expected to become central later on. Life moved on. Circumstances changed, and the agreement faded into the background of my daily routine. The situation escalated when I was formally accused of violating that contract. The language used against me was firm and authoritative, leaving little room for doubt or discussion. According to the claim, my actions had crossed a line, and the consequences were presented as inevitable. From the outside, it appeared straightforward. A contract existed, obligations were outlined, and I was positioned as the party who failed to comply. That framing shaped everything that followed. What made the experience particularly isolating was the assumption that resistance would be emotional, not factual. The expectation was that I would deny responsibility, argue intent, or attempt to justify myself. Instead, I focused on understanding the agreement itself. I read it carefully, not once, but repeatedly, paying attention to sections that had never been discussed during the dispute. Buried within the standard language was a clause that addressed the exact circumstances being debated, written clearly and without ambiguity. By the time the hearing date arrived, I understood that the outcome would depend less on persuasion and more on whether that clause would be acknowledged. Preparation replaced uncertainty. The document was no longer a formality, but a structure holding every argument in place. Nothing precisava ser exagerado. Nada precisava ser interpretado. Tudo já estava ali, definido por palavras que haviam sido escritas muito antes daquele momento. The courtroom, however, was not built for quiet confidence. It rewarded presentation, authority, and assumption. That contrast between appearance and substance defined the experience that followed. Enquanto as vozes mais altas ocupávamos espaço, o documento permanecia silencioso esperando o momento certo. And it was that silence, anchored in a single clause, that set the stage for how one overlooked agreement would soon reshape the entire hearing. The first time I realized this case would not follow a normal path was the moment I received the official notice. It arrived without warning, written in cold, precise language, outlining accusations that framed me as careless and unprepared. According to the document, I had breached a contractual obligation tied to a professional agreement signed years earlier. There was no context, no acknowledgement of how the situation had evolved, only a rigid interpretation presented as unquestionable fact. Reading those lines, I understood that the story had already been written for me by someone else, and I was expected to step into the role they had assigned. What struck me most was how confidently the notice assumed my silence, as if my lack of legal representation would naturally translate into a lack of defense, reducing my position to little more than a formality. As the hearing approached, the pressure did not come from fear, but from expectation. Everyone I spoke to assumed the outcome was obvious. Without a lawyer, I was seen as someone making an emotional decision rather than a strategic one. The narrative around me became fixed, an individual overestimating their understanding of the law, walking into a courtroom unprepared. What no one questioned was why I had chosen this route. I spent days revisiting the contract in its entirety, not skimming for reassurance, but studying each clause line by line. The language was dense, structured to discourage careful reading. Yet within that complexity, I noticed a provision that addressed exceptions under specific conditions that matched my situation precisely. That clause did not stand out at first glance. It was positioned among standard procedural language, written in neutral terms without emphasis. However, its placement was intentional, and its wording left little room for interpretation. It outlined circumstances under which responsibility shifted, provided certain criteria were met. The more I read it, the clearer it became that the accusation against me relied on ignoring this section entirely. What concerned me was not whether the clause existed, but whether it would be acknowledged. Legal disputes are rarely about what is written. They are about what is recognized, interpreted, and accepted within the structure of the court. On the day of the hearing, the atmosphere reinforced every assumption made about me. I entered alone, without the visual authority of legal counsel beside me. Conversations paused briefly, then resumed, as if my presence required no further attention. The opposing side appeared confident, organized, supported by documentation, prepared to present a straightforward case. Their strategy was simple: portray the situation as a clear breach, supported by selective references to the contract. From their perspective, the absence of a lawyer on my side reduced the risk of unexpected resistance, turning the hearing into a procedural exercise rather than a contested evaluation. When proceedings began, the tone was formal and efficient. Statements were delivered with certainty, emphasizing obligation, failure, and consequence. My name was used repeatedly in association with known compliance, each reference reinforcing a predetermined conclusion. I listened without interruption, noting how often the contract was mentioned without being fully examined. Sections were cited out of sequence, selectively chosen to support a narrative of fault. At no point was the document treated as a complete framework. It was reduced to fragments, each one serving a specific argument, while the rest remained conveniently unspoken. When it was my turn to speak, the shift in attention was subtle but noticeable. Expectations were low. I did not begin with defense or denial. Instead, I asked for the contract to be referenced in full. I directed attention to a specific section, identifying it by number and paragraph. The request alone introduced hesitation into the room. This was not anticipated. The clause I mentioned required careful reading, and more importantly, it required acknowledgement that the situation was not as simple as it had been presented. The courtroom moved from assumption to examination in a matter of seconds. As the clause was read aloud, the tone of the hearing changed. Its language directly addressed the conditions under which the alleged breach would not apply. It outlined responsibilities, limitations, and exceptions that aligned precisely with the timeline of events under review. What had been framed as negligence now appeared conditional, dependent on factors previously ignored. The clarity of the wording left little room for reinterpretation. This was not a technical loophole, but a deliberate provision designed to manage exactly this type of scenario. The reaction was immediate, though restrained. The opposing side adjusted their posture, flipping through documents in search of an alternative angle. The judge requested clarification, not from me, but from them. That moment marked a shift in authority. The assumption that I had misunderstood the contract was replaced by the realization that it had been selectively presented. The hearing was no longer about whether I had failed, but whether the accusation itself had overlooked essential contractual language. By the end of that session, the narrative had reversed. What began as a confident presentation of fault had transformed into a reassessment of responsibility. I remained composed, not because of confidence in the outcome, but because the document had spoken for itself. The contract, once treated as a formality, had become the central voice in the room. Chapter 1 of this experience was not defined by confrontation, but by the quiet power of written terms finally being read as they were intended. After that first hearing, the case no longer felt distant or abstract. It followed me into my daily routine, into moments of silence where my mind replayed every exchange in the courtroom. The initial shock had passed, but what replaced it was something heavier: awareness. I now understood that this was not just about one clause or one hearing. It was about how narratives are constructed, reinforced, and defended when authority assumes compliance. The opposing side did not retreat after that session. Instead, they recalibrated. Their confidence shifted into strategy, and I could sense that the next phase would be less about clarity and more about pressure. In the days that followed, communication intensified. Letters arrived referencing additional interpretations of the contract, framed in language that sounded technical but avoided the clause that had disrupted their argument. The tone was no longer dismissive. It was assertive, designed to re-establish control. Each message implied that the earlier hesitation in court was procedural, not substantive, and that the outcome remained inevitable. What stood out was how often these communications referenced authority rather than substance. They cited precedent, expectation, and process, assuming that repetition would outweigh the document itself. I responded by doing the opposite. Instead of expanding my argument, I narrowed it. I focused exclusively on the agreement and the sequence of events tied to it. I created a timeline, mapping actions to clauses, obligations to conditions. This was not about interpretation. It was about alignment. Every step I had taken was documented. Every decision traceable to a specific section of the contract. The more structured the timeline became, the clearer it was that the accusation relied on isolating moments while ignoring context. The contract was designed to be read as a system, not as isolated statements. As the next hearing approached, the atmosphere changed again. This time, the courtroom felt less performative and more analytical. The judge entered with familiarity, already aware that the previous session had introduced unresolved questions. The opposing side adjusted their presentation, introducing new arguments that attempted to reframe the clause as secondary rather than central. They suggested it was conditional in ways that limited its relevance, emphasizing intent over structure. It was a subtle shift, one that relied on complexity to dilute clarity. When I addressed the court, I did not counter with emotion or speculation. I returned to the document. I asked that the clause be read alongside the sections preceding and following it. Context mattered. Contracts are not collections of independent rules. They are layered frameworks. Reading the clause in isolation allowed it to be minimized. Reading it in sequence restored its purpose. As the sections were reviewed, the logic of the agreement emerged naturally, revealing how responsibility was meant to flow under specific conditions. What became apparent was that the opposing argument required omission to survive. It depended on treating the contract as fragmented, selectively authoritative only where convenient. Once the structure was visible, that approach weakened. The judge began asking questions that focused on sequence and intent as defined by the agreement, not by assumption. Each question narrowed the space for reinterpretation. The courtroom dynamic shifted again, this time more decisively. Despite this, resistance persisted. The opposing side introduced procedural delays, requesting additional reviews and extensions. On the surface, this appeared reasonable. Beneath it, the strategy was clear: prolong uncertainty, increase fatigue, and encourage concession. Legal pressure does not always come from direct confrontation. Often, it comes from time. I recognized this and chose consistency over urgency. Every response was measured. Every submission aligned strictly with the contract. There was no deviation, no expansion into areas that could be reframed or challenged. During this period, I became acutely aware of how perception influences process. Without representation, every action I took was scrutinized more closely, framed as unusual or risky. Yet that same absence removed layers of interpretation. I spoke only through the document. There were no rhetorical flourishes, no appeals beyond what was written. This simplicity became its own form of resistance. It left little room for distortion. By the end of the second phase, the case had transformed. It was no longer a question of whether the clause applied. It was a question of why it had been ignored in the first place. The narrative of incompetence had dissolved, replaced by a quieter, more uncomfortable possibility: that the accusation itself was incomplete. Chapter 2 was not about victory or resolution. It was about persistence, about allowing structure to outlast strategy, and about understanding that in systems built on language, the most powerful response is often to let the words speak uninterrupted. I realized the case had entered its most critical stage. This was no longer about misunderstanding or oversight. It had become a test of endurance and credibility. The opposing side had stopped pretending the clause was irrelevant. Instead, they shifted toward questioning my interpretation, implying that while the clause existed, it could not reasonably apply the way I claimed. This subtle change mattered. It meant the contract itself was now unavoidable, but its meaning was being contested. In legal conflicts, that is often where pressure intensifies. Because interpretation opens the door to authority, hierarchy, and persuasion rather than certainty. What followed was a pattern I began to recognize. Arguments were framed in abstract language, deliberately distancing the clause from the real-world events it governed. Hypothetical scenarios were introduced, none of which matched what had actually occurred. The goal was not to disprove my position directly, but to blur it. Stability became the strategy. Every submission mirrored the last in structure and tone. This repetition was intentional. It reinforced reliability. In systems built on documentation, consistency signals credibility. Variation invites reinterpretation. I offered none. The atmosphere in the courtroom reflected this shift. The tension that once accompanied each session gave way to measured discussion. Questions were fewer but more precise. Each one narrowed the scope of uncertainty. The opposing side spoke less, choosing their words carefully, aware that each statement would be weighed against the document rather than against persuasion. Silence began to carry more weight than argument. As Chapter 4 drew to a close, the case had moved beyond confrontation. It was now in the hands of process. The contract had been examined, contextualized, and acknowledged. What remained was formal recognition of what had already become clear. This chapter was defined by consolidation, by the gathering of all elements into a single, coherent framework. The outcome was no longer a matter of possibility, but of procedure. When structure holds, resolution becomes a matter of time, not debate, unfolded slowly, almost imperceptibly, as if the case itself had decided to withdraw from attention. This stage was defined less by what happened and more by what did not. There were no new accusations, no reframed arguments, no additional documents introduced. The silence was deliberate. In legal environments, silence often signals recognition without admission. The process had reached a point where movement risked exposure and stillness became the safer choice. I understood then that momentum had shifted entirely. During this period, the court entered deliberation. This meant no speeches, no immediate responses, only review. The agreement, the timeline, the submissions, all of it existed now in written form, unaltered and complete. There was nothing left to add without reopening questions that had already been resolved. That finality was quiet but firm. I continued to receive procedural updates, each one neutral in tone, each one reinforcing that the matter was being considered in full. What stood out most was how the narrative surrounding the case dissolved. Early on, there had been certainty, assumptions, and confidence expressed openly. Now those elements were absent. Communication became minimal, focused solely on process rather than position. This absence of narrative confirmed what argument could not: the structure held. When a claim can no longer sustain a story, it loses its leverage. I reflected often on how perception had shaped the early stages. Entering without representation had created expectations of vulnerability. Those expectations had driven the initial confidence of the accusation, yet the contract did not respond to perception. It responded only to sequence and condition. That contrast defined the turning point. Once the document was treated as authority rather than accessory, the imbalance corrected itself. There was one final exchange during this chapter that clarified everything. The court requested confirmation of a factual detail tied directly to the clause in question. It was a procedural request, not argumentative. The confirmation aligned perfectly with the documented timeline. That alignment closed the loop. No further interpretation was required. The clause applied. The conditions were met. The conclusion followed naturally. As days passed, the waiting tested patience more than confidence. Outcomes delayed invite doubt, even when logic feels settled. I resisted the urge to anticipate resolution. Action creates expectation, and expectation creates vulnerability. Instead, I remained anchored in the only constant the case had ever offered: the written agreement. It had not changed. Its language remained precise, its intent intact. When Chapter 5 ended, the case existed in a state of near resolution. Not because a decision had been announced, but because the framework no longer supported uncertainty. Everything that could be examined had been examined. Everything that could be challenged had been challenged. What remained was acknowledgement. This chapter was defined by restraint, by the understanding that sometimes the most decisive phase of a conflict is the one where nothing more needs to be said, not with an announcement, but with confirmation. A brief notice arrived, procedural in tone, informing me that the court had reached its conclusion and that a final session would be scheduled to formalize it. There was no language of victory or defeat, only closure. That restraint mattered. It reflected what the case had become, not a dispute fueled by emotion or persuasion, but a matter resolved through structure. By this point, the outcome was less important than what it represented. The process had reached the end of its logical path. When the final session took place, the courtroom felt different from the very first day. The earlier assumptions were gone. The atmosphere was measured, focused, almost neutral. The judge summarized the case carefully, retracing the timeline and the contractual framework that governed it. Each reference aligned with what had already been established. There were no surprises, no reinterpretations. The clause that had once been ignored was now central, cited clearly and without hesitation. As the conclusion was read, it became clear that the accusation could not stand as it had been presented. The contract did not support it. The obligations attributed to me were conditional, and those conditions had not been met in a way that justified the claim. Responsibility, as defined by the agreement, did not rest where it had been initially placed. The decision did not rely on exception or sympathy. It relied on alignment between language and fact. What followed was brief. The case was resolved without escalation, without penalty, without the consequences that had once seemed inevitable. There was no dramatic reaction from the opposing side, only acknowledgement. That response spoke volumes. When outcomes are undeniable, resistance disappears quietly. The process closed itself. As I left the courtroom, I understood that this experience was never truly about the hearing itself. It was about how systems respond when assumptions are challenged not with confrontation, but with clarity. Entering without representation had shaped expectations, but it had not changed the document. The contract existed independently of perception, and once it was allowed to function as intended, it corrected the imbalance on its own. Chapter 6 was not about triumph. It was about resolution. It demonstrated that structure, when respected, does not require amplification. It only requires patience. The agreement that had once been treated as a formality had proven decisive, not because it was clever or hidden, but because it was complete. In the end, nothing new was created. Nothing dramatic was revealed. The truth had been there from the beginning, waiting to be read in full. This final chapter closed the case, but it also clarified something broader. In environments built on language, authority follows precision. When words are allowed to mean exactly what they say, outcomes become predictable. The hearing ended the way it should have from the start, not through argument, but through acknowledgement. Looking back on everything that happened, what stays with me is not the tension of the courtroom or the weight of the accusation, but how easily assumptions can replace facts when no one slows down to read what is already written. From the beginning, this case was framed as inevitable, as if the outcome had been decided the moment I walked in alone. Yet nothing about the resolution came from confrontation, emotion, or persuasion. It came from patience and structure. A contract that had been treated as a formality became the most reliable voice in the room once it was finally read as a whole. This experience showed me that humiliation often relies on speed. Speed to judge, speed to assume, speed to conclude. When that speed is interrupted by clarity, the entire dynamic changes. I did not need to raise my voice or prove my worth publicly. I only needed to stay aligned with what was documented and allow the process to catch up to the truth. The outcome was not dramatic, but it was definitive. In the end, the hearing did not change the agreement. It revealed it. And that is the quiet lesson this story leaves behind. When facts are consistent and language is precise, time works in their favor. What begins as humiliation can end as resolution, not because power shifts, but because clarity remains.